Sanjay Kapoor joins in with his perspective on where the sector is headed, as does Naveen Kulkarni, co-head of research at PhillipCapital, to make sense of the strategies that are being deployed to gain more market share. Mr. Kapoor, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks very much for taking out the time. Good morning. How do you look at this tariff hike and what it would mean for the change in the strategy for all the players in garnering more market share?
Well, good morning to all of you, and I can only begin with saying that I often get confused at the speed with which we start discounting the stocks, and I also get confused with the speed at which we start celebrating the stock. I am of the opinion that there are at least 1.5 good newses for the sector, and I'll explain the half to you. One is very clearly that the sector is consolidating, and we are moving from an unsustainable perfect competition to probably a much more sustainable oligopoly, and that leaves on the table at least 20% share organically or inorganically with marginal players that can be acquired with the players who will play this game on a longer term basis and the more sustainable balance sheets, and there are 3 of them in the market today. So I think that's a real solid news in the market. The half good news is that Reliance has begun to report their numbers, which obviously puts pressure on them to show improvement quarter on quarter and also be more and more transparent on what things are at their end going forward. And on the other side, they've taken some corrective measures on the prepaid and postpaid side of the smartphone users, and that should be accretive for them. Will all incumbents have the leeway to come and ape up to those or match up to those prices? I'm not too sure, because what has happened is that on 4G and 4G experience, Jio has taken a lead, and most of the incumbents are playing a catch-up game, and therefore they need to take some very hard calls on their technologies because they manage 2G, 3G, 4G all simultaneously, and Jio is only 4G. So will they have an experience which matches up in the long run to make sure that they do not lose out the market on 4G and video experience to the challenger in the market? I don't believe that will happen, but a lot of investments will have to be made, and the balance sheets need to permit that. You are right that on one side, Airtel has its assets on the towers that it can liquidate. It's also got an option of liquidating its Africa assets, and therefore probably has a much more solid balance sheet compared to others. In the
Sanjay, you were talking about you getting confused as to how the market is discounting and, putting a premium to these telecom stocks. Tell us, we're in the hot seat. It's becoming really, really confusing as to how to try and value these telecom stocks off late. But tell me, with now Jio undertaking some price hikes and tariff revisions in some of their most popular plans for 59 rupees for 3 months, do you sense that the battle is now shifting to retaining a subscriber base as opposed to adding and expanding one?
No, I don't think so. I think we need to segment the market. There's a segment of smartphones in which Jio has penetrated deeply. They cover almost 85% of that market, and therefore they could be content and probably be looking at farming rather than hunting in that segment of the market, which is probably the smaller piece. But on the feature phone side of things, which is a very large canvas, almost about 500 to 600 million customers, out of which about 150, 170 even today spend about 150 to 170 rupees. They've not even begun the game there, and I think you will see a lot more action in that part of the market. And also there'll be endeavor to grow that market into the feature phone space, into smartphone space eventually, because that's where the big money lies. And I totally agree. The Maslow's hierarchy has changed. It has moved from roti, kapda, makan to cell phones, and cell phones really come down the Maslow's hierarchy. And therefore you will see that smartphones will become more and more pervasive as people experience data that they have not been able to do on feature phones, because feature phones of today only provide you an option of GPRS and Edge, which according to me are absolutely dead experiences. And if the feature phone customer suddenly starts experiencing data on 4G, you will see migration from feature phones to smartphones really accentuate in
fair point, Sanjay. You know, I have a small MTNL broadband. I'm still one of the old school guys. I have MTNL broadband. The service is not bad. It may not sound fashionable, but yes, I use MTNL. But the interesting bit here is that because I have a young kid, I use Netflix. I also watch a lot of data. My data consumption now is well north of 50 GB. And perhaps a year ago, 2 years ago, my personal data consumption at home was not even 5 GB. That's the kind of data which we are consuming, whether it is video, whether it is app, whether it is banking operations, something else. But I guess the biggest consumption in India is actually data consumption.
Data,
Okay, Naveen, now let's purely break this, into stock market, terminology. Do you think the worst is behind telecom stocks? The run-up in a Reliance or run-up in Bharti in the month of October has been extraordinary. But I think that Reliance mein jo move aaya, it's largely because of the telecom business, nothing to do with the petrochemical or the refining business.
Yeah. So again, two ways to look at it. One is where do you see the valuations heading for the telecom industry? That's point number one. And point number two, how the earnings will pan out and how the stocks will move in the direction. So earnings, I think, is pretty much the market has factored in pretty much the worst. IUC numbers are known, so those numbers are factored into the estimates. Now the question is how the valuations will move. So peak valuations for the telecom sector has been, let's say, 10 times EV EBITDA. Now going ahead with the industry structure of just 3 players, and there is going to be consistent visibility of monetization of the value that these telecom operators are offering. I see this re-rating which the telecom industry has had, this can sustain, and this can sustain for a prolonged period. So while earnings will always be back-ended for the telecom industry, but the re-rating is always going to run ahead of the earnings fundamentals. So that is a very, very sustainable thing that I am seeing right now. For the likes of Bharti at 10 times EV EBITDA, probably 1.5 to 2 years from now, is something which is not unimaginable. Probably it was unimaginable 2 to 3 years back when the capex intensity was extremely high. Now that is very, very, I would say, visibility of that happening is very high now.
But Naveen, the challenge for a Bharti idea would be that they're still dependent on voice. In the Reliance Jio ARPU numbers that came out, I'm assuming that those numbers are transparent numbers. 156 rupees ARPU is a function of data. Who has the data has the ARPU now. And for Bharti in Idea, with the kind of network which we have, I mean, let's be clear here, our data networks or our mobile networks are not the smartest networks. They may claim 4G, but you fail to even get a true blue 3G service here. They will struggle to move up the ARPU.
Yep. So again, ARPU again is a function which is dependent on the lowest cost producer at this point in time. So if you see, Jio is consistently increasing the monetization because the value that they are offering is quite significant. So they started with a 309 plan, then now it is 399 and it is currently 459. So they are raising the rates. So they will keep doing that because they are offering the kind of value which I think the customer would be willing to pay. So that is point number one. Question for the other players is whether they can match up to the quality of service that Jio can provide. All these players, Idea, Vodafone combined, I would say, it's not looking at Idea in all isolation or Voda in isolation, or Bharti for that matter, have sufficient amount of spectrum. Whether they have the capacity that Jio is offering right now, maybe not. Maybe 6 months from now, whether the capacity will be better, definitely the capacity will be better because these players are also investing in the networks. So it's going to be a question of economics where one is what price point and how much data will be consumed, and second aspect will be the what is the capacity that these players will be developing. So from that perspective, I think that the industry is moving in that direction of data monetization, providing better quality of services, and the competitive landscape is going to shift more towards a fight on QoS, quality of service, than a pure tariff kind of a play.
Mr. Kapoor, just one aspect of how the expansion on subscriber acquisition would move. Would it really be about getting new people into the fold, getting new subscribers, or acquiring current subscribers from the incumbents? For example, I haven't switched over from my service provider to another network, and it would be hard for me to do that. But there could always be the option that I choose to add another service provider to my usage and overall usability. How do you see the trend panning out on subscriber additions?
So I think, first of all, subscribers will also get bucketed based on digital services. You might end up, acquiring a particular operator's services for voice. But the moment data begins to happen on 4G with another operator and you find the experience is superior, you might just move on your data or data application onto that. So there could be a split. I mean, for me, the entire revenue stream for operators is bucketed into 4 buckets. So there's voice and SMS. SMS is dead, voice is declining. Then there is access for data. Which the world over has remained static after a certain percentage of penetration happens and then begins to plateau or come down. The only growth aspect for most parts of the world is digital services. I believe that as digital services mature and as data access matures, of course, there'll be a shift based on the experience that you get, because ultimately every customer in the market would want a video grade experience with the operator that he works with. And therefore, there'll be a shuffle. And especially the biggest shuffle will happen in the segment, which is the feature phone segment, which is today completely deprived of any data experience in the market. So there'll be a big shuffle in the market on services based on experience.
Okay, fair point. So Sanjay, I want to just go back to that ARPU number which we got from Reliance Communication. It's very difficult to look at one number and react what the inside story here is. But let's assume that this number is a realistic number. And if we can take this number with a pinch of salt, who will ultimately be getting the wallet share of the telecom market? Anybody can claim that, okay, I've got A, B, C subscribers, but frankly, that's not the story.
Yeah, so I think I, in a more simplified manner, try to explain that. I can only reiterate by saying the biggest value buckets in the market will be data access. And data here meaning the 4G access, and the other will be digital services. I think these two will determine who takes away the biggest kitty of the market. So everybody needs to move eventually on data access to 4G, because 4G seems to be the minimum standard for video that will satiate a customer's requirement in the marketplace. And second is who develops the digital services. So whether they are financial services, whether they are education services, whether they are entertainment services, and so on and so forth. I think these will be the two biggest buckets, because voice is passé and SMS is dead.
Naveen, who do you think will win the battle eventually amongst the 3 players?
See, Airtel is definitely doing pretty well in terms of they saw the market well ahead of, they read the market much ahead of the other incumbents. So they have done pretty well. Jio, of course, has the capacity, but of course, there is still a lot of hurdles that they have to cross. There is still the feature phone market which they have to garner sufficiently. So there are aspects which they have to cater to. But Bharti is pretty much an all-service provider, and I think their focus and their branding is pretty much on the lines where the market is going to be probably 2 years from now. So I think, and apart from that, inorganically they have done a fantastic job.
You didn't even mention Idea, it's not in the race at all.
So that is where I think Airtel is. Idea, Vodafone combined, once the entity is combined, then the strategy will start evolving. Because as of now, they are in a mode where they are probably digesting the merger, they are still chalking out the plans on how to merge their businesses.
Would that make it a value play?
Yeah. So that is definitely a value pick. That is a very, very straightforward value pick. See, Bharti is at a 9-year high. Idea is probably at a 5-year low. Right. So from that perspective, Idea, there is a rub-off effect and it will continue to do well. I don't doubt that. But the strategy for Idea, how they are going to evolve, that will come after the merger. They also have to invest because they are at least 1.5 to 2 years behind Jio in terms of where the capacity needs to be.
So for now, you think Bharti is the best bet?
Bharti is a very, very straightforward bet. Idea is a more risky bet, but probably upside is also much more.
Okay, Sanjay, let me get closing comments from you as well. A year ago, if you would have discussed Reliance Jio, there were doubters. There was a big question mark on their model sustainability and their entire effort to gain market share or do land grab by coming out with free services. But the scenario has changed and still the growth is strong. So if you have to map the last 12-month journey for Reliance Jio, what to your mind has been the biggest surprise which experts like you were not anticipating about a year ago?
Look, Reliance took some very innovative bets. While the market was still not sure whether the technology will be 3G or 4G, they bet on 4G. When the market was still at TDM, they bet on Volte. When the market, had not thought about using Aadhaar cards to validate a customer, they went into biometrics and started doing that. When the world was still fixated with the old infrastructure providers, they went in with Samsung as an infrastructure provider that nobody. So I think their ability to take bets, and they moved the whole market from per dime rates to bucketed rates. So they have taken some big calls which have come right. I mean, anybody who was watching them from outside would have said at least 2 or 3 of those calls will fail. But I believe many of them have worked for them. So, whether they will make a virtue out of this business, whether they will give anybody run for their money in the long run, we are all waiting and watching. But in the short run, definitely they have taken the position of being thought leaders in the market. And I think that has surprised the market positively.
Okay. Sanjay, Naveen, gentlemen, appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.